And welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. I am your host Tyrant, where we take things from movies, TV shows, pop culture, try to create them in the real world and test them one-on-one from the media they come from. And in today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at Masamune, Sephiroth's giant nodachi from the Final Fantasy series. It's a fascinating fantasy weapon because, first off, it's based off like a real weapon. But it's not too far off. It's actually pretty close to like a actual valid weapon. And that is, I feel like there's two main differences between Masamune and like an Odachi, right? And that would be, first off, the length. Masamune is a lot longer. And then on top of that, it seems to be that Masamune doesn't have a real aggressive curve. Now, there might be examples of Nodachis or Odachis having more or less of a curve, but Masamune is quite straight. It's interesting. I didn't realize how straight it was until I looked at like some still images of it. But apart from those two differences on the game sword versus, historical versions, there's also another difference, and that is how Sephiroth actually uses it. This is something that I find interesting because with a large blade like this, I immediately, think to like a Zweihänder, Spadones, Montante, that sort of stuff, right? Where you want to perform crowd control, keep people away from you, use the reach of your blade to your advantage, obviously. From what I can tell, especially from a lot of clips, he doesn't fight that far away from the blade. He doesn't use the reach to the advantage, which I find interesting. Now, how you actually use a nodachi or odachi historically is also interesting because I've had a look, and from what I can tell, I may be wrong, you guys can correct me in the comments if any of you have more information than me, and that is, it seems to have been used on horseback, which I think makes sense. Now, I know people are immediately going to comment that it was used this way or that way, especially for like anti-cavalry, right? But the truth is there seems to be a lot of contradictory information, people saying it was, people saying it wasn't, so I don't really know. I'm just going to go with it was used on horseback because there's some solid art depictions of it. But that means I couldn't really find too much information on how you would use it just on the ground. So all that means is that I'm just going to be using it how I would use other large blades. I still think that it will be really, really effective. Just like this segue to today's sponsor, Flexispot, ergonomic chairs and standing desks. As I've gotten older, I have genuinely developed a passion for this. I really wish that I had discovered them like a decade ago. My body would have really thanked me for it. And just to really drive home the point, I will show you my actual real chair. This is the cheap gaming chair that I bought a couple of years ago and have used, as you can see by the wear and tear on the subpar materials. But then if we compare that to the C7, it has 93 degrees of lockable backrest, it has latex padding and adaptive lumbar support. And I can't believe that this is even possible, but it has a footrest as well. I didn't even know you could do that. It'll also comfortably support people from 5'7", shout out to my short kings, all the way up to 6'9", and has a weight capacity of 300 pounds. Last time I checked, I'm not 300 pounds. So if we go through some of the adjustable features on the C7, that means that the headrest is adjustable, the back support, the lumbar support, the cushion that you sit on, your arm rests, while also still having a footrest. That's crazy for an ergonomic chair. There's also a 30-day risk-free trial with 10 years warranty and direct replacement parts. So use code C7YTB200 to get a $200 discount. You heard that right, a $200 discount. Like I said before, I'm genuinely a big fan of ergonomic stuff, and I can't recommend it enough, especially if you're getting on in years like myself. So thank you, Flexispot, and with that, let's get back to the episode. Sephiroth's sword Masamune, a very complicated topic because it kind of exists in the real world. This one here is an odachi or an odachi, however you want to, whichever one you want to choose. Basically, big fucking katana. And this is a real world sword, and it means that you can actually use it. When you look at Masamune or, Sephiroth's sword in the actual Final Fantasy games and stuff like that, it passes the realms of realism, right? However, something like this is completely wieldable, and look at it. Like, I know comparing it to something like the Berserk sword, right? Like Guts' sword, it looks kind of small. Relatively speaking, this is still a really, really, really big fucking sword. For example, if I take that off, you're not looking too bad now, are you? So it's a really, really big sword that can actually be used practically and functionally, and that is what makes something like this actually not bad at all. Like, you see that shit? So that's kind of why I wanted to actually talk about something like an odachi or odachi in today's episode, rather than like Masamune as like however long it is, 20 feet long or whatever crazy it is. Because we actually have real world big giant swords that are exactly that. And I think that is far more interesting to discuss, because you're bringing something into the realms of possibility, and you're not making too many sacrifices. You're just making it a little bit shorter. And when we say shorter, this is still a huge sword. Like we did with the gut sword, we made this one out of aluminum, so it's a lot lighter. It's still really big, but it's a lot lighter that you can swing it around and actually use it, and there's a lot of interesting stuff here. So when it comes to something like this, you already have a sword that is completely wieldable, completely able to cut and be used. So why not talk about it? As a sword design, all right, it's basically a katana, right? It's just a really, really big katana, which has some benefits, but also has some detriments. The first detriment is, actually, it's kind of an interesting one, because Masamune in the games doesn't have too much of a curve. If you look at this, this has quite a pronounced curve, and that creates an interesting dynamic with the blade, whereas on a katana, because they're relatively short, you don't get the same sort of thing. And what is that? That is how the gravity affects this blade. Because it's so curved, it wants to curve in your hand. So the center of balance on this and the point of gravity is kind of wild. So it doesn't feel too nice when you swing it around. Ohayo, yoroshiku Tyrant-san. Subscribe desu. Jane. So you would still have the dynamic with like a one-to-one replica, but it wouldn't be as bad as this one. So that's kind of one of my first gripes when it comes to this blade. Because that you have that big curve, it just means there's a lot more torque on your hands trying to keep the edge alignment. And there is also the interesting point that we brought up with the Dragon Slayer sword, is that a lot of fantasy giant swords are just really thick, right? They have a lot of girth to them. However, with something like this, it's the same thickness and the same width as a regular blade. So it's just really, really long, to the point of absurdity. So there's interesting differences between this fantasy sword and other fantasy swords, of course. So let's do a little bit of cutting with it. How does this one actually feel when you use it? Usually giant swords don't have sheaths or scabbards or sayers or whatever. So when you actually look at how Sephiroth actually uses his sword, funnily enough, he doesn't use the main advantage that often, and that is the range. With a big, giant sword, you have a lot of range. There is a lot of distance between you and your enemy. That's the good part. He's fighting kind of down in here with it, which is, I don't know why, to be honest. I think it looks good on graphics, sure, but that's about it. When it comes to actually, when you want to cut something and do something, use your range as your advantage. That's the whole point of this. You don't have to get so close. Personally speaking, I would use it the exact same way that I use other giant swords, and that is large sweeps for crowd control, to keep people away from me. On top of that, using my reach as an advantage to keep people, like, look how far away he is from me. He's not getting close to me without me thrusting in him. Let's thrust in Tony. That sounded terrible, but I want to stab him. Nice. Didn't get through that time. I didn't hit as hard as I should have. So next up is an interesting point, and that is, what would I prefer out of these two styles of giant sword, right? With the Guts' sword, if you can wield it effectively, it's very, very intimidating. It's a monster. But even if you can wield it effectively, it's still just a heavy sword, right? Like, it's just absurdly thick without too many benefits that, you know, that width brings. So I don't know if this is something I would go with. But then when it comes to something like a Nodachi or Masamune, whatever we want to call it, there are some detriments to that as well, and that is, I think, obviously it being single-edged, I would prefer a double-edged blade just for like lots of different practical use applications. If one edge, gets damaged, you have a second one. On top of that, you can do reverse edge strikes, you can do a lot more effective crowd control. The list goes on and on. But in terms of this sort of design, I think the curve is something that I wouldn't want on a giant sword, simply because of that center, like how the mass is dispersed, right? Because doing this, it's kind of hard to get it over on camera what actually this is like, but essentially all of the weight flops over every time you bend the blade because there's so much mass at the tip of the blade. So having an aggressive curve, not really my sort of thing. And then when you look at Masamune, because it has such a shallow curve, you could probably just chuck a secondary edge on that thing. It's almost straight. So many jokes I could have made then. And because you don't have a lot of the benefits that come with such a big, intimidating, imposing weapon like Guts' sword, where it has a lot more mass, a lot more just bulk to it, where you could just probably power through other people's strikes, because this is a lot thinner, you don't really get that benefit. So there's pros and cons to both of these designs when it comes to like fantasy giant swords. Personally speaking, I would prefer to just go with like a Zweihander or Montante, a Spadone, Claymore Warsword, pretty much any of those sorts of things, because I'm going to be able to use them far more effectively. With something like this, I do like it. I think that there is a lot of application that you can really use for them, and they're an interesting blade, right? In terms of their design, they're very beautiful. Honestly, a katana is a beautiful sword in and of itself. Then when you make it really fucking long, it's like, it's double beautiful. How's that? Big swords are cool. So when it actually came to me spinning around and moving the Nodachi, it was quite fascinating because my brain was having a real hard time kind of just keeping the primary edge going and not using, secondary strikes, because I've practiced that more. It's really difficult. And you can kind of see it in my movements. There's a tiny bit of like, I would say, computing time where my brain's like, nope, hold on, I've got to keep that primary edge faced forward. And then on top of that, one of the other big issues that I had, especially with this version, I'm not going to say this is with other versions, but specifically with the version that I was using, that handle was just way too short. I could feel it. I didn't have enough leverage, and especially when I started moving around, it just felt, it's not too far off like a regular katana handle, which is really not good for this length of blade, right? So that handle was also a big detriment. All right, guys, you know what time it is. It is time for Tyrant's initial thoughts score. Tits for short. Now when it comes to Sephiroth's sword Masamune, we're going to be talking more specifically the real world example. That's what we're going to be rating. Something like an Odachi or Odachi. Simply because the actual one-to-one is just, like, it's too big. We don't really have swords that will work, essentially. And this is going to be kind of similar to the Berserk Guts giant sword, because a lot of the same benefits and detriments that I brought up with that one also apply to this one. It's a really big sword. The only difference being that this is the width, right? So this one is far more wieldable. So why don't we get into comfort? This is far more comfortable. You can swing this around, you can use it. It's a little bit heavier than obviously regular swords because it's a lot bigger, but it's still completely wieldable in every single regard. So, I mean, when it comes to the comfort, it's a katana handle. This one's a little bit short. It's actually supposed to be a little bit longer, so we have a bit more, leverage on the blade. But 10 out of 10. This is comfortable as. I love it. When it comes to the design, this is interesting because, like I said, we're rating specifically something like this, not the one that's 30 foot long. We're talking more specifically about this. Okay. I'm more than happy to go with an 8 for design. It's still really functional and it's still really usable. There are some issues when it comes to like the balance because this one is so predominantly curved, but like I said, ones that have less of a curve are gonna have this issue to a lesser degree. Some of the issues that I have with the design are just more, with a sword this long, I would just go for a double edge because why wouldn't you? You have so much blade. Have 2 edges and you're good to go. In terms of a guard, now you're not going to be using a cross guard, for example. That doesn't have a cross guard, but because this one is a little bit shorter than something like that, there is the chance and the possibility, and especially the way that Sephiroth uses it, he fights up here, I would want a cross guard on this, or just some sort of bit more of a robust guard on it. But I think that's fair for design. Next up, let's go with wieldability. I mean, you can use it. Like it's fine. There's not really any huge detriments to it. You just need to kind of know how to use it and you're good to go. So, I mean, 10. Like, there's no big issues here. I don't have an issue with using this, so 10 out of 10, you are good. And then we come to effectiveness. This is where it's probably going to lose a couple of points because it's so long that you can put some power into it. It's reasonable for thrusting, but at the same time, this is one of those things where just because you make it longer, specifically with a katana type blade, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better. So I would probably put somewhere for the effectiveness, probably around 7. And the reason why is because this is still shorter than a spear. So a spear halberd is going to wreck it. And that's the same with, you know, the berserk sword as well. It's really good. It's just, it has some drawbacks. And then especially when it comes to, like, you know, enclosed spaces, using big giant swords is not really going to be that useful. So there's pros and cons. I'm more than happy with that. But that gives us a final score of 35 out of 40. Oh, I didn't expect that. But you know what that means? We can slap a seal on it. I mean, that's pretty good. I can't remember what I gave the gut sword, but I think it was in the 20s, if I remember correctly. So this is actually quite a lot better. Isn't that funny? When you have a actually properly designed giant sword, they're really good. This one I like, I'm happy with it, I don't mind it. Some of my gripes with it are just more of, you know, design that I personally prefer on other things. But apart from that, it's still a functional weapon that is really, really, really cool. Now, when it comes to Masamune being, like, you know, 30 feet long, that's a different story. But something like a odachi, nodachi, whatever you want to call them, big fucking katana, they're really cool. But that's going to be all. Thank you guys for watching. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below what you thought of today's episode. And you can support this channel. Down below there will be some links to my Patreon or YouTube memberships. It really helps out, guys. But that's going to be all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week in another episode. Have a good one.